That's life right there. um, so, welcome. It's been a minute. Busy, busy. But I figured I'd take some time now. We are less than 4 weeks away from having this baby. And the more that I've thought about it, the more I've contemplated it, the more anxious I've worked myself up to be. Um, it's one of those things where it's a very big life event. I feel lots of responsibility, lots of, I don't know, really, if we're putting it the way that we need to put it, it's lots of anxiousness. Um, and I'm brought to scripture, I'm brought to books that I've read. Recently, a few friends of mine and I have been reading through a book called Respectable Sins, where it talks about sins that we as culture, we as church members, we as things of that nature have made more respectable than other sins, which is totally not true. But that's a whole nother conversation. And one of the things that is on that list is the sin of anxiety. And I think that whenever I'm thinking through this, and what I've learned is when I'm placing my will above the will of the Lord, that's when the anxiety starts to come in, because I'm worried about what's going to happen next and what's going to go on from there, and who does this affect? How does this affect them? Oftentimes not even thinking about how it affects myself, but thinking myself through a rut of, well, it's others. But with us being so close to the time of our little girl being here, the anxiousness is rising, but I've also come to learn a little bit about it. And, there's a constant verse, and I don't remember where it's at, but it says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in prayer and supplication give these things to the Lord, because it is His will." And I think that this book, Respectable Sins, talks about this, and it talks about it along the lines of this anxiousness, this anxiety. It's not wrong to feel anxious. First of all, that's a feeling that a lot of us have. There's levels of anxiety. There's things like that we can build into. But I think that one of the biggest things that he drove home in this book, and I wish I would have had it out to show you, but I don't. That's pretty typical. But one of the biggest things that I've seen with this is that whenever I'm letting that anxiety rule me, that is basically saying, "Lord, your will for my life is not enough." Because just like the moon is always round, and that's something my pastor coined a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago at this point. But just as the moon is round, God is still faithful. And no matter if I can see the rest of the moon, right, I know in my head that it's still round, and God is always faithful. But in addition to that, God's will is going to happen, regardless of what I say, regardless of what I do. All of the things that I do or do not do, they're going directly according to the will of God, regardless of if I'm doing it rightly or wrongly or sinfully or whatever else it may be, right? So it's one of those things where, as I've thought through this, the book took me to the Gospels, and in Matthew 26, I believe, Jesus takes his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he is praying there. And even Jesus, who is the perfect example for us, he drove us forward. He is approaching his death, and he is praying to God, "If this cup may pass from me, allow it to pass from me." And what he's talking about is his death. He doesn't want to do it. Not in a sinful way, but in a, let's find another way. If there is another way, let it. But at the end of that section, it talks about it, and he says, if this cup may not pass from me, allow for your will to be done. And it speaks so firmly into where we're at and what we believe and how we believe it. This anxiety that I feel over having a child is well-founded. It is good because it's a big life change. There's things in my marriage that are going to change because of this. But I don't know. It's one of those things where I have been persistently reminded that God's will be done. And I think that if you really, really believe that, then you can take those anxieties, you can truly place them at the foot of the cross, and you can allow them to be felt, because it's good to feel feelings. Like, I don't think that you should just bury them deep inside, because that's a good way for letting it explode later. But allowing to feel those feelings and to process those feelings out, but understanding that his will is constant and his love is pure enough and his grace is merciful enough to us that anything that takes place in our lives, good, bad, everything in between, can be shown as Christ. It's crazy to believe that we serve a God that is so constant and so loving, but yet so just and merciful. It's wild because we have a punishment that we can't live up to. Like, we are going to a place where we don't want to be, but in his kindness and in his mercy, he brought us down and he built us up in order for us to be with him, but not on our own doing. The Lord's doing is what triggers that, and it's in the perfect work of Jesus and his death and his life and his resurrection and all of those things, in order so that we have access and we have a sentiment that we can sit next to him as well and be part of that adoptive family of Christ. So all that to say, anxiousness, anxiety is not a good feeling, but it is a good thing whenever it is channeled properly and it is pushed forward for the will of God and not thinking our own selves into a rut. Clinical anxiety is nothing to play with. Like, that's not something that I'm talking about here. I'm talking about physical, like everyday, everybody's anxiousness. It's not, everybody has it in some degree or the other, young, old, everything in between. But that's something that we need to build into. All right.